Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring an area that has demonstrated more than its fair share of human risk in action: politics. In recent years, we've seen plenty of examples where politicians have made bad decisions. My guest, Eliot Wilson, has seen politics from the inside. After leaving university, he became a clerk in the UK Parliament, essentially helping to run the machinery of policy-making, debating and legislation. So he's ideally placed to provide a perspective on what goes on behind the scenes, good and bad. I invited Eliot onto the show because not only is he an engaging speaker with some great stories to tell, but his experience of working in one of the oldest democracies inside a building that isn't exactly built for 21st century decision-making gives him some interesting perspectives about how old systems can function and not function in today's world. On the face of it, there are lots of practices and processes that make the UK parliamentary system not fit for purpose. But there are others that work remarkably well and have stood the test of time. Whether you're familiar with the UK and recognise the dynamics Eliot describes, or all you've seen of our parliament are traditional uniforms and lots of people shouting at each other, I think you'll find this of interest. If any of the terms Eliot uses are unfamiliar, you might understandably not know what a select committee is. There are links to definitions and explanations in the show notes. Don't worry though, what you're about to hear isn't a technical exploration of how Parliament works. Rather, it's some fascinating insights into human risk in politics. So please enjoy my discussion with Eliot Wilson. Eliot, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Delighted to be with you, Christian.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. Look, and I know you pretty well, but my listeners don't. And one of the things I think is fascinating about you is the career that you've had. And you chose to go and work for the UK Parliament. So I wondered if you could talk us through how that happened and what the thought process was behind that. Well,
it was, as often is the way with these things, it was a combination of accident and later design, I think. I was reading for a PhD in history, and I was towards the end of my research starting to write up, and I was intending to go into academia and get a teaching job or a research job somewhere. But I was aware that I needed a plan B because the job market wasn't particularly secure at that time and posts were quite difficult to come by. So I had the standard thought that an awful lot of people in their early 20s have of, well, I suppose I could be a civil servant. And when I looked into it, there was an option not to go into the mainstream civil service in Whitehall, but to be a clerk in one of the Houses of Parliament.
So for non-UK listeners, I should just add, civil servant basically means working for the government.
Yes. Whereas if you're taken away and you become a clerk in either the House of Commons or the House of Lords, you are working for that house rather than the government. So it's a sort of slightly different stream of the recruitment. And I thought that looked, on the face of it, quite interesting. And then I thought about it more and realised that actually the sort of skills that you were going to be expected to display and to develop in Parliament were actually going to be very different from those in Whitehall, because if you're working for government, then you're going to be doing a lot of research, you're going to be doing policy formation, you're going to be doing operational delivery in some cases. So it's very much working out the policy of a department and then making it work. Whereas in Parliament, you're doing something which is very different, which is working for a corporate body as opposed to one individual person. You know, we don't work for one MP, we work for all MPs, and then subsets of them in some cases. And you're basically adapting to what they see as their job and their priorities, and you're there to facilitate what they want and need to do on behalf of their constituents and in order to hold the government to account. So that seemed to me to be much better suited to the skill set I thought I had. And it also seemed to be much more fun. It was on a much smaller scale. When I joined the House of Commons in 2005, there were only about 90 clerks in the House. I think it's probably a little bit more now, but not that many. So there was a collegiate atmosphere about it as well. And of course, you were meeting and dealing with members of Parliament every day. And that shows you them in the round, to be polite about it. Shows them at their very best, which can be extremely good, and their very worst, which can be not so good. So it seemed to me a much more interesting career choice, something that I could do very different things within, and also use some of the skills that I'd learned as a sort of proto-academic and as a doctoral student as well.
And so you're working in this very, very old building. So the people will recognise the UK Houses of Parliament sort of iconic building, and they've probably seen, whether they live in the UK or not, sort of scenes from the chamber of the House of Commons, which just looks like to the uninitiated, and probably to the initiated, it looks like a bunch of people shouting at each other. Mm. But it's this beautiful old building, very old, and you're there making sure that the machinery keeps ticking. So regardless of who's in power, you're there to make sure that things function the way they need to function. And so it always struck me as a little bit like a hotel where the guests might change, but you're maintaining this beautiful old hotel that has various things it needs to deliver, albeit that the hotel's doing something really important, which is managing the process of government. So it's quite fascinating where you're trying to run something that is dealing with the problems of society today, and yet it is, it's been around for a long time and has survived for a long time by having traditional processes.
Hmm. Well, actually, the hotel analogy is quite a good one because, yes, there is that aspect of dealing with all members on the same footing. And when there's a general election and a change of government, you deal with the new government the same way you dealt with the old one, and the new opposition the same way as you dealt with the old one. But also you do, if you're there for more than a few years, you start to see not only the same faces, but the same archetypes of members of parliament. So you begin to identify a new MP as, oh, he's the new version of X or Y. And of course, you have to do all of this with a professional face, with hopefully polite and friendly face. There is an extent to which you are always on customer service, if you like, with the customers being members of parliament. And that can be difficult, that can be challenging. And it's something which I think the House of Commons certainly, and the House of Lords to an extent, is still dealing with as to how they operate sort of robust HR policies when you don't have direct employees, but you have members of parliament who are effectively 650 small businesses. But yes, I mean, a sort of a well-known hotel that's always struggling a little bit for money and some of the carpets are starting to lift is about right for a lot of the experiences I had.
And I mean, you say you've sort of seen them at their best and at their worst, and I wouldn't ask you to breach any confidences, but I mean, it must give you some tremendously interesting insights into the way that decisions are made and the way that laws are made. And sort of we would like to assume, you can, it's really interesting when you look at politics from the outside, and particularly at the moment, there's a lot of cynicism around it. And of course, you will have seen things that will demonstrate to you that cynicism is entirely correct, right? There are people out there not doing very good jobs. But equally, there's a lot of work going on that's just never seen, that people don't know what goes in. And so if you like, the PR bit from the Parliament doesn't give you the full picture by any stretch of the imagination. I wonder what your sort of thoughts were on the one hand, it needs to have an element of sort of secrecy and confidentiality to function. On the other hand, it is the Parliament making really important decisions about people's lives.
Well, there are a number of things there, but I think the sort of reputational and communications issue is quite an important one. And I would say that, wouldn't I, having moved on to work in that world. But I think for a long time, Parliament was very bad at managing its image, because the most common scenes that you see in Parliament as an outsider are Prime Minister's questions on a Wednesday, which is very noisy, very rowdy. There's a lot of shouting. It's confrontational. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of asking of questions and answering of questions in a spirit of earnestness and desire for the truth. And you see that equally for big set piece debates, when the Chancellor makes his annual budget statement or anything like that. And people focus on that, rightly, in a sense, because it's all they see, and assume that that's what it's always like. But those really are the anomalies of parliamentary life. Those are the bits when members of parliament like a bit of theatre. In some ways, they're a safety valve, because it's a very, very stressful workplace for everybody, because what you're doing is very important. There's never enough time to do everything for anyone, both staff and members of parliament. You're always under pressure. And so a little bit of letting off partisan steam on these big occasions is understandable. But what a lot of people from the outside don't see, although they're beginning to now, is the work that's done what's called upstairs on the committee corridor. So in select committees, which are scrutinising individual government departments, and even less seen are the committees which consider bills, proposed laws, clause by clause. They'll go through them line by line and have discussions about important points. And in both of those occasions, in bill committees, but particularly in select committees, there's a much less partisan atmosphere. The sort of unofficial motto of the committee system when I was in it was very much that people left their party hat at the door. And so you did get people cooperating across the parties and forming coalitions on different issues within the committees. And, it was regarded by most chairmen as a failure if you produced a report which the committee didn't agree unanimously, because in a sense you wasted your time. If you hadn't examined the evidence, heard the conclusions of experts, looked at data yourselves, and then come to a conclusion which you could all agree to, then you hadn't really got the point of it. I think Parliament's getting a little bit better now over the past maybe 10 years in trying to sell select committees as a product. So people will now tune into the television, God, they don't do that anymore, do they? They'll switch on the television and they'll see on the news clips of committees, and they'll see the sort of horseshoe with politicians sitting around it and a witness in front of them. And they'll have some sort of visual reference point, some understanding of what's going on. But there are still basically two problems, and there's an external and an internal problem. The external problem is that people aren't very interested in politics when you write it with a capital P and put it in a separate box. People are incredibly passionate about things that are all actually political. They're passionate about the health service, they're passionate about schools, they're passionate about how the welfare system supports those most in need. They're passionate about the armed forces, they're passionate about how much tax they pay, all of these things which are basically political choices and decisions. But if you put the word politics on it, a lot of people tune out very quickly. And so if you're operating in that incredibly narrow attention window already, and you're trying to grab a fraction of that to talk about what's happening in Parliament, then you really are, you're getting a tiny, tiny glancing fraction of people's knowledge, understanding, attention, interest, all of those things. So that's the external problem. The internal problem is that the way that Parliament works, and there is a very good book about Parliament literally called How Parliament Works, doesn't really interest many members of Parliament either. And I'm not saying that they should all have, read Erskine May, which is the parliamentary Bible from cover to cover. But a lot of them, particularly if they don't expect to be there for very long, will come in, take a look at the place, and will want to know how they can do basic things, how they can put questions to a minister, how they can present a petition, how they can have a debate, all of these sort of crucial parts of an MP's work. They'll want to know how they do that. When you get onto the more elaborate parts of parliamentary procedure, like what does second reading of a bill mean? What's the committee stage? What's report stage? How do I table an amendment? What's a reasoned amendment? Why are some amendments ruled out of scope? Things like that. They're not particularly interested. And so they rely heavily on the clerks, who are the procedural experts. What that also means is that they can get very easily frustrated. Because they see a thing they want to do as part of their job as an MP, and they say to an official, I want to do this, and the official has to explain that, well, actually, you can't do that. But what I always found very important, and some of the best clerks I learned from used to do, was always try to be able to say, well, you can't do that, but you could do A, B, or C, and they would have roughly the same effect. Because the thing which I think members of Parliament don't understand enough, and it would be nice if they did a bit more, was that all of the rules around Parliament, all of the procedures, all of the sort of what the press tend to call arcane regulations or arcane parliamentary procedures, the officials didn't put those in place. Those were agreed by the House, in some cases many, many years ago, but all of them are the rules of the House, and the House has the power to change them whenever it wants, if it can act as a single body. But it means that you do deal with people, and this is one of the most interesting things in behavioural terms that I found about dealing with members of parliament, that you're dealing with people who are by and large well-intentioned. I mean, I met very few people who were not there basically to make things to make the world a better place. So you've got people who are largely well-intentioned, but who are incredibly stressed, who are under pressure from 5 or 6 different directions, who may be worried about whether they're going to be in Parliament come the next election, if they're in a marginal seat, and who just want to get something done and get it done quickly so they can tick it off their list. And so they don't always display, understandably, the patience that an official needs to say to them, look, I know what you're saying. I get the gist of what you're saying. The bad news is that you can't do what you want to do, but the good news is there are different ways of doing it, which might work or might even work better, or, you could cooperate with some other MP who's doing something different. And, setting out a menu of options for what they could do to soften the blow of telling them what they couldn't do.
And I'm fascinated by this psychology of I could lose my job. So on the one hand, clearly the reason you have elections is you can then throw out bad people and vote in better ones. So there's always this very solid principle. But of course, that's not strictly true, because there are plenty of members of parliament who sit in safe seats where, it would take something pretty seismic to chuck them out. And there's always this joke about if you stuck a rosette on a pig, it would get, people would vote for it, depending on the right colour. And so I'm struck by this sort of combination of, on the one hand, you've got sort of lifers who would bring experience and knowledge and sort of how the place works. So that's a positive, but the negative would be that they get a little bit too comfortable. They don't feel that electoral pressure. On the other hand, you've then got people coming in who don't really know how it works, who may have some bright new ideas, who have that time pressure. And of course, it's fascinating because it's not necessarily a case that the people who are best suited for either of those roles end up in the right seat. It's all a little bit random. And so I'm intrigued what your sort of thoughts are. Does that sort of balance itself out and work, or do we get some terrible decision making as a result of those dynamics?
There is certainly that dichotomy between people who are forever on a knife edge and people who think that they can basically bank on their 25, 30, 35 years or whatever and then call it a day. I think that's lessened slightly since the Labour win in 1997, because there was such a seismic shock of some Tories in what they had thought were safe seats losing them or coming close to losing them, that I think as a sort of institutional memory, Parliament still has a shudder about that. So I think there are fewer people now who look at their majority in their constituency and think, well, I'll never be kicked out. And I think the idea of a safe majority has probably gone up by 5,000 or so to, So if you've got a majority of 20,000 in your seat, yeah, you're probably safe, short of a revolution and people, dangling from lampposts. But if you've got a majority of 5, 6, 7,000, you don't know. You could have either a huge switch between the two parties, or as we saw in 2019, you could have a strange sort of realignment of politics with the Conservative gains in traditional Labour heartlands, so that you've now got Conservative MPs for parts of the northeast where I grew up. A Conservative MP for Bishop Auckland and for Blythe Valley seems absolutely mad, but it's the new reality. And yes, you're certainly right in that it would be nice if the sort of the less effective members were the ones who came and went, and the ones who really got it were the ones who were in safe seats. But you can't always depend on that. I think, again, there are two reactions that members can have to the sort of way that Parliament works. And there are probably the happy majority in the middle. But at one end of the extreme, you can get people who come in for a safe seat. So they're going to be there for 25 or 30 years. They look around, they think, this place is fantastic. I want to know more about it. I want to know how it works. I want to become at the absolute top of my game, so I know what I can do when and how I can, perform various tasks. And so you get people who are very procedurally aware for a member of Parliament. But on the other side, you get people who come in, hate it on sight because it's institutional and it's very forbidding in a physical sense, and it's traditional, and it's in some ways sort of arcane, though that's not a word I like. And they hate everything about it, and they will find fault with everything about it. And those two extremes are similar but different, because from an official's point of view, you can work very easily with the lifer who decides that he's going to know all about reasoned amendments or something. That's fine. You can deal with it. Somebody who hates the whole institution on, I was going to say on principle, but on instinct, and therefore thinks that the whole thing is against him or her, is much more difficult to deal with, because if they don't think that anything honest and straightforward is ever done in Parliament, then you almost can't start a conversation with them about how they could actually do something honest and straightforward. And so that can be difficult.
I'm struck by your comment about the quality of people coming through. I wouldn't ask you to name names, but feel free if you want to. But, there's always this sort of phrase that we get the politicians we deserve. Do you think that's true?
There is an element of that. I think one change that I've really noticed, I joined the House of Commons in 2005, so towards the end of Tony Blair's time as Prime Minister, was that there was an increasing feeling, and some people will think this is a very good thing, that members of Parliament were there to serve their constituencies almost to the exclusion of everything else. So everything they did, they saw through the lens of, the stereotypical Tunbridge Wells Gazette or whatever. How will this play in the local pub or the local paper in my patch? Now, from a constituency point of view, that's fine. And members of Parliament should remember why they're there. And they're there because they were elected by a group of people within a defined geographical area. But, it's often said that MPs are representatives and they're not delegates. They don't go there to follow the wishes of their constituents on every matter under the sun. They're there to exercise their own judgment to an extent. The classic example was, and perhaps still is, capital punishment. If you took a poll in the UK on whether we should restore the death penalty, there's a good chance that the public would vote yes, whereas Parliament has always stood firmly against it ever since it was abolished in the 1960s, because it sees abolishing the death penalty as a progressive move for society. There's both the sort of civilized abhorrence of it and also the potential for getting it wrong, which is literally a fatal mistake. So we do have to accept, I think, unless you want Parliament to be very different, that MPs are there for their constituents, but also there as part of a national body to hold the government to account and to make big decisions on things like going to war or creating the NHS back in 1947, 48. So when you've got those people coming in with a very strong constituency focus, they can operate differently. It's not that they're bad people or stupid people or people who don't pay attention, but they won't necessarily see the broader picture of what's going on in Parliament. It is frightfully difficult to name names without being very indiscreet. I think if I can talk about good people, I've worked on a lot of select committees, and I've had some excellent chairmen. I will invidiously name some and not others. So to any of those who are listening that I don't name, I do apologise. But when I first worked on the Health Committee, the chairman was Sir Kevin Barron, who was a Labour MP for Rother Valley. And his great priority, because he'd just taken over as chair of the Health Committee at that point, was to abolish smoking in public, because he felt that it was an avoidable danger to the public. People were being exposed to secondhand smoke, which was a known killer, and that it was unacceptable for this to be happening. And so we did an inquiry into what were then the government's proposed legislation to ban it back in 2005-06. And he was absolutely passionate about the subject. We took exhaustive evidence. We talked and thought about it a lot. And we came to the considered conclusion that the government hadn't gone far enough, that there were mistakes in the legislation, there were loopholes that had to be closed. And the government took that on board. And then you ended up with legislation which effectively banned smoking in communal public places and brought down the incidence of secondhand smoke and the attendant diseases hugely. So Kevin did a very good job on that. He carried the committee with him. There wasn't a dissenting voice, either from the government side or the then Conservative opposition. It was a happy ship working on that inquiry because everybody understood, no matter what their individual beliefs, that they were engaged in this collective endeavour. It was a group of 11 people from wildly varying backgrounds, though some medical experts. We had a GP, a former hospital doctor. And that was a really good introduction to Parliament because that was Parliament working. Equally, my second chairman on the Defence Committee was James Arbuthnot, who was then a Tory MP, now in the House of Lords. And he'd been a minister back in the 90s, actually in the Ministry of Defence. And he said to me once that the reason he'd always wanted to be chairman of the Defence Committee was that when he was a minister, he spent far more time preparing to appear in front of the committee than he ever did to appear at the dispatch box on the floor of the House of Commons. So he understood that it was much more penetrating analysis, much more well thought out questioning, much more serious stuff, really. So there are certainly MPs who throw themselves into to scrutiny of the government and really get engaged. But there are others, and I won't pin tails on donkeys, if I can use that phrase, but who either just aren't up to it on all sides of the political divide. I mean, I've come across members who are just surprisingly stupid people, and you kind of think, how did you get here? I mean, literally, how did you follow the signs to get here? Or there are people who, if they've been around a while, just become a bit too cynical about the whole endeavour. And, it's very easy and very British to be cynical about politics. And it's a cynical profession, I think. But if you lose any sort of spark of optimism or sincerity, then it just becomes a grind and it becomes a game that you play. And ultimately, that's just not very satisfactory for anyone. So I haven't offended anyone directly there, I hope, just people as a class. So I think I shall draw a veil at that point.
And I mean, it's fascinating because you've painted a picture here. So you have these set pieces that we see on TV, which is sort of the shouting and the point scoring. And then you've painted a picture behind the scenes, a lot more thoughtfulness, challenge, collaboration. Mm. And so is it fit for purpose? Do the processes work in the way that they should? What room do you see for reform? Is that balance the right one?
That's an interesting question. If I focus on the House of Commons, because reform of the House of Lords is a whole other can of worms, because there are so many things that people accuse the House of Lords of needing to change. If we look at the House of Commons, the big dispute that a lot of people have is the electoral system. They believe that our system of first past the post doesn't deliver a fair result and that we should have some kind of proportional representation. That's an interesting dispute, and it's one that I don't necessarily lie awake worrying about. But I don't think it would necessarily change the processes of the House. It would change the character of party politics because you'd be much more likely to have coalitions. But I think we saw when we had the Conservative Lib Dem coalition in 2010 to 2015 that actually the processes of the House went on much as before. There was a little bit of difference in terms of allotting memberships of committees and things like that, but basically the infrastructure worked. I think that the great issue that people have with the way that the House of Commons works, and this is very much a sort of nerdy internal point, because I don't imagine that the general public think about this for any nanosecond, and why should they, is that the government controls the agenda of the House of Commons. And that's written into Erskine May, the sort of handbook of parliamentary procedure. The government sets down what business the House is going to consider each day. And there are some exceptions. The opposition is given a certain number of days to allot for subjects that they want to talk about. And there are days for bills introduced by backbenchers, which usually don't get made law. But basically, the government decides what's going to happen. And that means that they are in an enormously powerful position. Because if there is something embarrassing or awkward, like COVID in recent times, that there seems to be a feeling the House wants to talk about, the government can just delay for a day or two until something's happened. The only real pressure is the court of public opinion. And I go back to what I was saying about the public not really paying very much attention. So the government can just hold out and not give in to a sort of inchoate feeling that there is something the House should be talking about. A lot of people think that the House doesn't scrutinise things enough. So, when we had the withdrawal bill from the European Union, which gave effect to Brexit, we had, I think, we had it all done in a single day, didn't we? And people said, oh, that's not enough time. But, I've seen bills take many, many days to get through the Commons, and people are still saying, oh, there's not enough time. And if they're not saying, oh, there's not enough time, they're sitting there towards the end of the afternoon looking at their watches thinking, God, hasn't this gone on long enough? Because one of the problems that I've always thought about making legislation, there's that old joke about there are two things you never want to see being made, sausages and laws. And when the House is making legislation, it's one of these things that is unfortunately just difficult. It's complicated. And it's not complicated because it's written in a certain way, although maybe it could be slightly more self-explanatory. It's not complicated because it's worded in a certain way. It's just difficult stuff. If you're introducing a bill to reform a certain part of the tax system, that's going to be a lot of pages of stuff to read, and it's going to be very difficult, and you're going to have to put your thinking cap on and think quite hard. And the House doesn't always have the appetite for that, because if you're a tax lawyer or an accountant or whatever, fantastic. That's your meat and drink. It's something you really want to get torn into and talk about ad infinitum. But if you're interested in social care or defence or the prison system, you've got no interest really in wading through a complicated tax system you don't understand. So the House always wants more until it gets it, and then it complains that it's got too much. There really is a strong element of that. And there's also only a limited amount of time that you can really sit. The UK Parliament gets a lot of criticism for what are called MPs' holidays. It's a phrase that really offends me, because when the House isn't sitting, MPs are not just sort of sitting sunning themselves. They are back in their constituencies, working through local stuff, seeing their constituents, holding surgeries, doing correspondence. MPs work hard. Let there be no doubt about that. However effectively they do it, however willingly they do it, they work damned hard. And my own personal view is they don't get paid as much as they are worth, but a lot of people would take exception with that. So we already sit far longer than most European legislatures, I think possibly than all European legislatures, and much longer than Congress in America. So we've got about as much parliamentary time to play with as we're ever going to get. And you've got to cram a lot in. And it's the natural way of politics that you're going to have quiet times and busy times. Towards the end of a parliamentary session, when when that programme of legislation is running out, yes, it gets manic, and you're passing proposed legislation back and forth between the Commons and the Lords at a very high speed, and it's all very tense, and things have to be done very much on the hoof. And yet there will be other days where there are a couple of debates about very general topics that maybe people won't turn up for. They might head off to their constituencies early. So I don't think there's a reasonable position you can hold that we don't do enough, given the constraints on it. There may be a complaint that we don't do it well enough. Maybe Parliament needs more resources in terms of scrutiny, though the resources have grown hugely dedicated to holding the government to account over the past 15, 20 years. And of course, if MPs got more financial support for their offices, there'd be an absolute outrage in the press. So that's a non-starter. So I think the House of Commons, and this is not an uncontroversial opinion, works pretty well if you take its work in the round. If you only watch the 6 o'clock news or equivalent, yes, you will often come away with quite a bad impression of it. But if you spent, not that anyone would, if you spent a week following Parliament round, looking at committees on bills, looking at select committees, looking at debates on the floor of the House, on adjournment debates, petitions, all of that kind of stuff, I think you get a much more balanced and much more positive view. And I think you'd realise that although we have quite an old-fashioned system in some ways, it's pretty adaptable and it stands up pretty well to rigorous scrutiny.
Fascinating. And I was struck by your comment around public opinion. And there's been some really good recent examples where public opinion has had a huge impact in a way that other politicians haven't. So if I think of Marcus Rashford, the footballer, who's done some great campaigning on child poverty, for want of a better phrase, and has literally single-handedly twisted the government's arm by, I mean, very loosely putting some tweets out, and that shifted government. I think that's a fascinating dynamic that we haven't sort of seen before. And I'm intrigued as to your thoughts on, is this a growing trend? Are there adaptations to that? Is that a good thing?
To take those in order, yes, I think it is a growing trend. I think it's explicable partly because more than ever, people have an instinctive distrust of politicians. They don't esteem them highly at all. They never did. I mean, there are a lot of people who talked about a sort of golden age of politics, which was never true. It had never happened. But I think when the Daily Telegraph exposed the expenses scandal in 2007-8, I think that was a reputational disaster for the House of Commons, which it may never recover from. I mean, I was working there at the time, and the public mood was, there was anger, but what was most corrosive, I thought, was actually just a sense of disappointment and resignation that, well, of course they're all on the make. And you could argue with taxi drivers or people on buses or whatever, all you liked, that actually some of the most egregious claims for expenses had been turned down, and that this was a system which the MPs had administered themselves but had got into a routine of using it as a sort of replacement for salary and things like that. But I think people looked at politics in those few years at the end of the 2000s and thought, yeah, well, it's just what we've always expected and thought. And I think that is really going to be very difficult to shift. And as I say, we may never recover that even that small degree of trust which people had before. It wasn't helped by the fact that I think the authorities didn't respond as well as they could have done. I think the parliamentary authorities and members of parliament didn't initially grasp how big a problem this was. They thought, oh, well, this is another Daily Mail story, well, Daily Telegraph in that case. It's going to be embarrassing for a while, but then it will, the caravan will move on and we'll be fine. When you've got former members of parliament being imprisoned for fraud, that might not be a big deal in some countries, but in this one it is. And so that cynical approach to politicians, that lack of trust, I think has given way to a huge appetite for non-politicians who can put together a coherent argument. And I think Marcus Rashford is a great example of that. I mean, let me make it very clear that I think Marcus Rashford, never met the man, never intend to. He seems like a very nice young man, very well-intentioned. He seems to have a good heart. He's being very well advised, but let that not take anything away from him. His instincts seem to be extremely sound, and he's being very effective. But there is an appetite there for people who aren't politicians to come in and, that terrible phrase that people always use, just use a bit of common sense. They don't engage in the parliamentary and political procedures and mechanisms. They just say, well, look, this is obvious to the man on the street. We need to feed hungry kids. And that, I think, is actually a useful reminder to politicians at some occasions that you're playing for very high but often very simple stakes. There were some MPs, particularly Conservative MPs, towards the end of last year who were getting into complex arguments about the role of the state and whether it was right that we as taxpayers should be subsidising parenting, and particularly subsidising bad parenting and things like that. And that's not to say that those arguments aren't worth having, but I think what Marcus Rashford discerned, either consciously or unconsciously, was that we'd gone beyond that, and that we were at a point where kids were going to arrive at school and leave school feeling hungry. And that, I think, in 21st century Britain just didn't seem to be acceptable. And so I think he's played it brilliantly, and he has been extremely effective. And it's been interesting to see that I think still some politicians don't understand why he's been so effective. And they get slightly uppity about, what does he know about it? He's a footballer. Well, perhaps, but, what do you know about it? You used to be a fireplace salesman or whatever. I mean, well, literally, the Secretary for Education did sell fireplaces. So I think that there's been a slightly sniffy approach to celebrities, because as a society, we both adore celebrities and also want to hate them and tear them down. But I think that could be a trend for the future. I think there is the idea that somebody could come in from the outside and shake up the system. And in a sense, that's what Nigel Farage tried to do. And from a European Parliament point of view, did it very well. He presented himself and UKIP and then the Brexit Party as, common sense people, the sort of people you'd meet down the pub. And that was true in both good and bad ways. But they were tremendously effective in an electoral way. I mean, they moved the needle on Brexit enormously. And although Farage was never elected to the House of Commons, he and UKIP and then the Brexit Party dominated our representation in the European Parliament for the last years. And I think it's a message which comes across very clearly to the public, because you can position yourself on their side against the establishment, even if, like Farage, you're a former, metal broker from the City of London and, somebody who likes a decent lunch with a couple of bottles of claret. And that's a very good play. The danger, I think, is that it's also the play, inexplicably to me, that Donald Trump made in 2016, that despite being, a billionaire, well, a possible billionaire who'd been given, $10 million by his father and had magically turned it into only 5 or whatever it was, was presenting himself as the spokesman for the ordinary guy. And people, driving taxis, people sweeping streets, people working in shops said, Hillary Clinton, she just seems unapproachable and not very likable. But Donald Trump, he kind of seems to be speaking my language. And you think, he would cross the street to avoid you. Right. Literally, he holds you in such contempt. And yet, Trump, for all his faults, and they are many, was elected by the Electoral College anyway, as this kind of outsider who was speaking to the ordinary people of America. And I think that is a danger in any liberal democracy, and in America particularly, but maybe in the UK as well, that you have somebody who uses the establishment as a target to get themselves elected, and by using it as a target ends up destroying it. And there's an element of, well, what next? But people are initially carried along on this wave of anti-establishment, anti-establishmentism, and disdain for conventional politics, and a craving for something new and more direct and more effective.
It's fascinating you talking, because obviously that my mind was wandering to the incident at the Capitol at the beginning of January, and the invasion of the physical space. It was much more than somebody's broken into a building. There was a real sense of it was almost it's the political equivalent of you've broken into a church and committed vandalism. It's that sort of level of sanctity. And I'm struck as you were talking, sort of one of the reasons that you get outsiders able to criticize is some of the so some of the things that have sustained these processes, particularly the physical architecture, but also the sort of the way meetings are run, the language, almost the impenetrability of it, is partly what's driving some of these forces. And so I sort of wanted to get your, what were you thinking when you saw what happened in the Capitol? As you look at the things that work really well, and the fact these institutions have been around for a heck of a long time, on the one hand, is why they're still here, because they've survived. On the other hand, some of those things that are massive strengths are also huge weaknesses, potentially, given some of the dynamics you talked about.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, obviously it is to be condemned. And I think even if you take a very constitutionalist view of American politics and history, and you portray yourself as trying to fight for the rights of the ordinary people, the violence and the attitude displayed were unforgivable. And certainly President Trump's involvement in initially encouraging it was appalling, and he's now been impeached for it a second time. It was shocking because, as you say, there is something seemingly inviolable about Congress. And that's partly because it's a very grand building, and partly because the Americans, this is a terrible generalization, but Americans have a tendency to invest with a greater degree of sanctity than we do their public buildings. I mean, at one point in Joe Biden's response, which generally I thought was quite good, he talked about the sacred process of confirming the Electoral College votes. Well, it's usually basically just an acknowledgement that something has happened, which is a procedure that goes on in Congress.
I mean, I looked at that process. I thought I clearly had never paid attention to it. It seems to me absurd. I mean, I don't understand the Electoral College anyway and what purpose that has, but let's not get into that. But I sort of looked at it. That's just rubber stamping a decision that's already been made.
Yeah.
So a pointless step that actually has now been demonstrated to be sort of probably even more pointless in a way in terms of if you want. But I thought it was fascinating. You're right. There's a real focus around that thing, which is not anything to be particularly excited about.
No, and it was invested with this religious significance, as if the Persians had urinated at the Parthenon or something. I mean, it was really extraordinary. I was shocked by how easily the protesters managed to breach the security, because one of the things I did in my time at Parliament was I was one of the sergeants at arms. So I would wear the literal tights and sword and sit in the chamber for long periods of time. And I'd be involved in the sort of security of the building, usually.
So that's a role where you're sitting there from way back when, that if somebody did come and attack, you would be the person defending.
In theory, yes, I would have been the person there to draw my antique 18th century sword and get them out. But fortunately, these days that's more the job of first the doorkeepers, but also the Metropolitan Police, who are on the parliamentary estate in some numbers.
Security professionals, right?
Yes, as opposed to somebody who likes dressing up. But if you do a compare and contrast, for a start, I don't think the crowds which we saw would have got anywhere near as close to the building as they did, because I think the Metropolitan Police are much better at proactive intelligence and about finding out about potential gatherings and mitigating the risks. But also, in much smaller ways, it has happened in this country. We had famously Otis Ferry protesting against the passing of the ban on hunting with dogs, which perhaps wasn't a constitutional hill to die on, but he felt very strongly about it. And he actually invaded the chamber of the House of Commons. I mean, he got as far as the floor of the House, which should never have happened. Fortunately, thank God, he wasn't ill-intentioned in a violent way, and he was dealt with quite quickly. But I think that occasion sits large in the collective memory of the security staff at Westminster. That and Rupert Murdoch having a cream pie thrust in his face at a committee meeting. Both of those were incidents which should never have happened, but were fortunately not very serious. And I think the idea that you could have got such a mass of people that they could have overwhelmed the perimeter security it's not something I can compute. And maybe it would have, maybe I'm being complacent, but I think the Metropolitan Police would have done a lot more and would have been a much better prepared. And also, I think, without wishing to dramatise it, I think they would have been more willing to take some robust measures, which would have been catastrophic, but would have got the job done in a sense. And what I thought was interesting was the the ease with which the protesters on the Capitol got through the barriers, and you almost seem to see the Capitol Police opening the barriers for them. So you wonder if that was a decision to avoid violence or if it was some kind of inside job. I don't know. I don't have any details. But it was shocking because whether we like them or not, we invest our public buildings with significance and importance, even if it's not the kind of devotional importance that the Americans have. So, if you think back to the film V for Vendetta, when the clock tower at Westminster is blown up towards the end of the film, for a start, I think there probably wasn't a clerk in the House who didn't have a little secret cheer from, all of their bad days at work being concentrated into the clock face being blown out. But even though it was a sort of fantasy film based on a graphic novel, there was something quite shocking about that, about this icon of our democracy, however healthy you think our democracy is, being destroyed. And of course, it goes back to the original Guido Fawkes in 1605. That was what he'd tried to do. And I mean, I've always thought with Guy Fawkes that if you think about it in any modern context, he was a terrorist. He was a religiously inspired terrorist. He was unsuccessful, but he wanted essentially to slaughter the political establishment en masse, and didn't. And we celebrate him in a slightly jokey way by putting effigies on him on bonfires and handing around mulled wine and sparklers. And you think that there is something wonderfully British about that this potential grotesquely catastrophic attack on our state architecture, which was foiled at the last minute because he was found in the cellar with gunpowder. We think is a sort of quaint old thing, and we think, penny for the guy, sir, and all that kind of stuff. But even in this country, I think Parliament is iconic, and the idea of that being infiltrated somehow with ill intent, and I think that's the critical thing, was deeply shocking.
Final question. I mean, you and I do work with companies, helping them think about how they can pivot and shift and adapt to changing circumstances. What would your thoughts be on Parliament? I mean, we've seen virtual Parliament being introduced to a certain extent. What are your thoughts about how it could modernise and where it ought to modernise and the sort of direction of travel? I mean, you've talked a bit about electoral systems, but what about the sort of the functioning of it and the way it presents itself?
Well, I think, firstly, I should say, not least as a tribute to former colleagues, that I think the way that the House of Commons has adapted to virtual sittings has been pretty impressive, actually. They've done it well and they've done it quickly. And it's been a huge job, from what I understand, talking to friends who are still working there. And it's been pretty seamless. You haven't had the IT fall over completely. And Parliament has been allowed to continue limited functions without people congregating en masse. But I was talking about this very thing, actually, to a former clerk of the House of Commons the other day, and I was asking him what he thought would go back to normal and what would become part of the new reality. And I think I agree with what he said, which was basically that I think there will be a split. I think the physicality of sitting in the chamber having a debate is something that members of Parliament will want to get back to, because they can see their chums, they can have whispered conversations on the sidelines, they can see ministers and badger them, they can be exposed to senior MPs in the voting lobbies when they're locked in for a short amount of time during votes, and nobody can get away. And that is a very useful lobbying technique, literally. But I hope that the authorities in the Commons will also look at the experience of virtuality, if that's what you call it, and learn some lessons from it. Because I think what they've demonstrated is that particularly committees can work virtually really quite effectively. And that opens up a whole new idea for example, committees sitting on a Monday morning when members of Parliament aren't traditionally in Westminster because they're travelling from their constituencies. So that opens up more of the weekly calendar. It opens up the idea of witnesses from other countries, because it means that you don't have to go to the other country just to talk to a group of parliamentarians from Australia or wherever. And I think it means also no travel time for witnesses, and so you can fit into their diary more reasonably. So I think select committees will want to preserve at least the option to do things virtually, though I'm sure they wouldn't want to do it all the time. But I think in the chamber itself, while virtual sitting has worked well enough in that people have been able to ask questions of government, there is still something lacking without the physical presence there, because when you're on a TV screen and you're on an internet link, there's that sort of delay, and you only get one question. You can't shout out. There's no heckling. Whereas if you're sitting, and I think people need to remember how small, relatively speaking, the House of Commons is as a physical space. So if you're sitting 15, 20 feet from the minister who's just given a rubbish answer to your question, you can shout out, yeah, but what about this? Or I'll come back to this, or that's, well, you can't say that's a lie because that's unparliamentary, but you can say that's economical with the truth. And I think the sort of, not the standard of oratory, because that sounds very pompous, but the way in which members interact in debates and questions has suffered and become more stilted with people logging in virtually. And so what I would hope would happen in that particular case is that the House of Commons Commission, which is the body which runs the House of Commons, will sit down and do a sort of lessons learned exercise from the virtual sittings and take what works from it and integrate them into new procedures, and be willing to let what didn't work as well slip. The other thing I think, just to conclude on that point, which will be quite contentious, is the idea of voting remotely, because one of the criticisms that's long been made of the House of Commons is that you have to vote in person on virtually every decision that is made. And that involves going through a physical lobby. There are two lobbies that run down the side of the chamber, and you have to walk through and be ticked off by a clerk. Well, ticked off, it's on a tablet these days, and nodded through by the tellers, so they've got an idea of how many people have voted in each lobby. And so it's a physical experience, and a vote takes about 15 minutes. Now, a lot of people who are sympathetic to modernisation have said this is ridiculous. We should be able to do it in 30 seconds. The European Parliament does this. Various other international bodies and parliaments have remote voting. The Scottish Parliament does it. Why is it taking us all this time? And so I think there will be a big push for remote voting to stay in place. I don't fully share that impatience with voting, partly because I'm instinctively quite traditional, but I think there are two things which voting in person guarantees. The first, which is the less important one, is this idea of putting members all together for them to have chats, for them to do little bits of business, to agree things, and also putting a new backbencher who's just been elected behind, say, the Home Secretary in a queue for the desks to get through. And, that lowly backbencher can suddenly say, oh, Home Secretary, you said you were going to write to me about this or that, or you said you were going to visit my constituency. And, the Home Secretary can't get away. So that is important, and I think some members do value that. Much more important, I think, is the kind of aspect of security, because what you don't want is members giving whatever ID it is to their assistant and saying, right, this is how I'm voting today. Can you just make sure you tap in at the regular times, because I've got a couple of meetings? Because inevitably people will do that. The reason that they introduced voting one by one going past an official of the House was that some of the more aristocratic members in the 17th and 18th centuries would occasionally send, their coachman in to register their name with their face covered, and that would all be a great time.
Of course, with face masks, even easier, right?
Well, absolutely. So I think what you would want if you did go for remote voting was some way of guaranteeing absolutely that it was the Member of Parliament and no one else who was casting that vote, because there's always been an insistence in the House procedures that wherever possible, it's the Member of Parliament himself or herself who does whatever act it is, and that they don't delegate it to their staff, because that brings in a lack of accountability, because if something goes wrong, the member could say, oh, well, I asked my research assistant to do it and he or she is obviously screwed up. So I think pinning accountability on the individual member of Parliament is very important. And I think that's something they should take into account if they do introduce remote voting. But I think there will be a lot of call for it.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, Eliot, thank you so much for putting some amazing insights. I will put links to as many of the things as I can find links to in the show notes, because particularly for overseas listeners, there'll be some things I'm sure they'll want to find out more about. But listen, thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Absolute pleasure, Christian.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Eliot for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about some of the subjects that Eliot discussed, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. You'll also find a link to the Pivot Point podcast, which Eliot hosts and which looks at managing change in the 21st century. If you're not already subscribed to the Human Risk Podcast, you'll find it wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major platforms. Equally, if you like the show and haven't yet left a review for it, please do leave a 5-star review on whichever platform you're using. It really does help. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Human Risk Podcast, but in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.